So what I try to do is to give a presentation on the EU as I would have liked to have because most presentations on the EU are very boring, I find. So what I try to do is to give a presentation on how I would have liked to hear about the EU for a first time. And what I find interesting is not so much the nuts and bolts, what the Commission does, what the Council does, what the European Parliament does. You can have that in any website. You really don't need me to explain that. What I find interesting is why. Why does it happen? Why does the EU exist? Why do countries want to become a member? Why even some countries are crazy enough to wanting to leave, like the UK? I mean, those are good questions. And it's not always easy to find an answer to that. So I'll try to give you an overview of that, and especially now, of course, in the context of enlargement, because a lot has been happening. And for the first time in many years, we can actually now say that in the coming years, the EU might again expand with extra member states. For horrible reasons, of course, because the dynamism started with Ukraine. Because only days after it was invaded by Russia, it applied for membership. And this was accepted by the Council, the member states. So that has a whole domino effect of impacts on the EU and on the other countries that had already applied for membership. So, first of all then, some very basic things, but there is a difficult question behind this. The EU currently, as it stands, 27 member states, about 450 million inhabitants. The question that lies behind this seemingly simple map is, what is Europe? And the question is more than just of academic interest, because it determines who can become a member of the EU, because the treaties explicitly say that any European country that fulfills a number of other conditions, but the key condition is being European, any European country has the right to apply for membership, and the word European has never been defined. If you look at the old maps of Europe, then the word Europe spreads to about the Ural Mountains in Russia. But it's a gray area, and the political answer to what is Europe is basically whatever the member states accept as Europe. And that can be shifting views, actually. And I'll come back to that another, because one of the current candidate countries I never would have expected to have been accepted as European, but apparently it has. It has been accepted as European, so I thought that was a big surprise. Now, just the whole story of enlargement itself, because the whole thing, of course, started in 1951 with the European Coal and Steel Community, the predecessor of the EEC, at the time what is now called the EU. And those 6 countries are called the founding members: Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands. The core of that integration thinking actually has been unchanged over the last 60 years. And it's important to get a sense, because when one speaks about EU enlargement, my first question is, well, what is the EU? What is being enlarged? Which is actually not such a simple question. The core thinking of European integration lies already in the concept of the European Coal and Steel Community, because these 6 countries cooperated to an unprecedented degree in those 2 sectors. And why those 2 sectors? These were at the time the key sectors in the preparation for warfare. You needed steel for your armies, you needed a lot of coal to produce a ton of steel. And the thinking was, this kind of cooperation would prevent any country, read Germany, to ever prepare in secret for war without all the other countries immediately knowing about it. That kind of thinking is actually what I would call the application of an old Sicilian saying. It's used also in The Godfather Part 2. And the saying goes, you keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And that is core thinking of European integration. You create trust by keeping each other extremely close. And you don't really have to like each other, you don't even have to love each other. You just have to know what the others are doing, because that creates trust. and they know what you are doing at the same way. This is always a two-way street. Now, this kind of thinking proved actually to be very successful, and especially in economic terms. And the thinking was expanded not only on those two sectors, but in basically all sectors of the economy. And that started to have very positive economic effects. There's one of the most researched questions in economics in Europe, the economic impact of membership. And there is no question about the very positive effect that this has on your economy. This is one of the reasons why countries want to join the EU. Certainly not the only one, but it's an important one. And that started to attract a lot of other countries. I'm not going to go through all of that, but I just want to say on Greece, Portugal, Spain, they entered quite late, and that has nothing to do much with economics. They could not enter earlier because they were dictatorships. They liberated themselves. Very interesting story in how they managed to extract themselves, and they almost immediately applied for membership. One of the reasons being that this would protect their democracy, because one of the key requirements of membership is that you have to have a democracy. Austria, Finland, and Sweden then entered as well in the mid-90s, and that timing is also no coincidence. I mean, there's stories behind these dry dates all the time. These countries entered because this was only a few years after the Berlin Wall had fallen. It was very clear that the EU was going to expand very significantly so. It was also the end of the Cold War, and these countries thought to join under the motto, if you can't beat them, join them. Plus, like I said, end of the Cold War, so there was a lot of pressure off to stay neutral. They didn't have to stay neutral anymore. And they joined not because they particularly liked the EU or very pro-EU, but like I said, a country doesn't have to be particularly pro-EU to join. A country joins because it feels it's in their national interest to do so. And there might be very many different reasons of why it would be in their interest to do so. And what I said, in this case, for these countries, they knew that the EU was going to be a lot bigger than it was already, which would have a huge impact on them, one way or the other. This is what I call the elephant argument. You imagine yourself to be in this room, and there's an elephant in the room, literally. So you're going to pay a lot of attention to the elephant, because it's bloody big, and it does whatever it does, and if it moves, you better move with it. There's very little choice you have in the matter. Now, politically and historically, a very important argument is that when you join the EU, you sit at the table where the decisions are going to be made that are going to hugely affect you one way or the other. You can also stay out, away from that table. The elephant is still going to do what it's ever going to do, and it's not going to take into account you at all because you don't sit at the table. So this is a big reason for countries to join, because they know if they join, they can have a voice in the decisions that are going to affect them one way or the other. And then better sit at the table to have a voice, of course. This is a very important political and historical argument for membership. 2004-2007 is what is referred to often as Big Bang, because you don't get 12 new member states at the same time. I personally was part of the teams for Cyprus and Slovenia. And very interesting, because enlargement politically is usually not very popular among the EU. The most you can hope for is that people don't really much care. Like, for instance, with Sweden, Austria, and Finland. People didn't feel threatened or anything. 2004 is the big exception to that. There was a real sense in 2004 of a reunification of Europe. Because historically speaking, the Iron Curtain, the division of Europe of the mid-20th century, was a complete anomaly in European history. That kind of division had never existed before. It was completely unnatural. And there was a real sense, both among the countries that joined after decades of repressive regimes, and Western Europe, as a reunification of Europe, a historical, very happy moment. And I still remember newspaper slogans in many newspapers that said, "Welcome to all the new countries." And that was unique, actually. That never really happened before. So by 2007, most of that feeling when Romania and Bulgaria entered had already dissipated. But at the time, there was also a lot of talk, for instance, about the peace dividends. We are not going to need armies anymore because there's the end of the Cold War. The USSR no longer exists. The Warsaw Pact has been disbanded. I mean, looking back, a lot of that sounded naive. Sounds naive now, but at the time there was a real feeling of that. Then 2013, for now, this was the last enlargement, a very small one. And then a bit of a shock in 2020, of course, or 2016, a referendum on Brexit, with 2020 the UK leaving. The Commission President Juncker at the time said, "We're sorry and you'll be sorrier." There's a lot of talk about remorse now. It was at the time Brexit. One silver lining there's several silver linings to the UK leaving, although it was never, I mean, it's never good for a club when members leave. It reflects badly on the club, even if they leave for completely idiotic reasons. But one silver lining was that it really put an immediate end to any populist talk about any other member states leaving as well. There was some talk about Frexit and Italo-exit and Nexit and other member states, because I thought, oh, this is a good idea what the UK is doing. Maybe we should do that as well. And the UK made such a big mess of it. It was just digging a hole, that it served as a perfect example of how not to do this. And that it is a bad idea in any case. There have been estimates that the UK so far has lost about 5% of its GDP had it stayed in the EU in terms of economic development, missing out on membership. It is entirely possible, I think, that the UK might, over time, in the coming, 5 to 10 years, reapply for membership. If that happens, the member states will be happy to let the UK back in. It was a big member state. It had a good track record of free trade, of supporting the EU in many ways, despite maybe its sometimes difficult reputation. The only thing is that there will be no more Mr. Nice Guy. So they will have to follow exactly the rules like everybody else. They will have to introduce the euro, no more special rebates, no more bending over backward to please the UK. Because the member states will still remember what kind of self-imposed crisis it put on the EU in a time when a lot of other things were going to happen, or were happening. So that will not be remembered. That will not be forgotten. So if the UK comes back, please, you are most welcome. You know the rules, sign here. Yeah? And the UK knows the rules very, very well, of course. So like I said, no special treatment of the UK anymore, which I think is fair, you know. And I hope they will come back. It will be good for everybody. So, just for completeness sake, a few other countries applied for membership, then thought differently of it. Case in point, Norway, they applied together with the UK, Ireland and Denmark at the time. Denmark and Ireland did not want to enter the EU without the UK because they had very strong economic connections with it. And the UK was kept out twice by France because the French president, de Gaulle, did not trust the UK for different reasons. They said it's a Trojan horse for US influence. And the second time said, well, the UK is falling back economically and it's going to be too expensive for us to take on the UK on board. Then in the end, Charles de Gaulle left and the UK could get in. But Norway twice did what I call a runaway bride. So they were about to enter. And it's like you stand in the church with your flowers and you think, no. You throw away the flowers and run out of the church. And that's what Norway did twice. Why is a point of contention? It's not quite clear. The thinking is it has to do with fisheries. Fisheries is very, very much part of the self-image of Norway. Same with Iceland, by the way. And they thought if we're becoming a member, then we have to share our fish, and we don't want to share our fish. Of course, Norway is also one of the richest countries in the world with gas and oil. They have a huge, huge pension fund or investment fund, a wealth, what's it called? It's an investment fund that basically covers the Norwegians for the next 10 generations. It's massive. We're not talking billions, we're talking trillions. So they can, in a way, they can afford to stay out, because there's a cost of getting in, but there's also a cost of staying out. It is not excluded that they might want to join now. The thinking at the time when we were dealing with Iceland was, well, if Iceland joined, and Iceland is culturally very close to Norway, if Iceland joins, then maybe Norway will start feeling really lonely, because Iceland is a member, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, the Baltics, everybody is a member, and they're still staying out. And why? What's the point? Because they're part of the economic European area, so they have to follow all EU laws in any case to get access to the internal market. But they have no voice in those laws. We just email them the laws. These are the laws you now have to apply. So, like I said, it's not excluded that they might become a member in the future, especially now, because of all the uncertainty in the world. But it's up to them. The EU will never invite a country to become a member, because it would constitute a political commitment on the side of the EU with nothing to show for it. Why should we invite you? You know what kind of great party we have, and if you can't see that, well, that's your problem. We're not going to invite you, because then you might say, well, what do you have to offer me? Maybe I don't have to pay for my drinks in the party or whatever. So, no, it doesn't work like that. The closest the EU ever gets to inviting a country is saying that the country has a European perspective. This is key, because European is something that you are or you are not. It is not something that you can become. Do this, that, and that, come back in 10 years' time, and then you're European. It doesn't work like that. You are it or not, even if it's a gray area. So if the Council says the country has a European perspective, that means you can become a member, because you have already met the key requirement, namely that you are considered European. And like I said, once you have that, then you can do a lot of other things, things that you can have to do, but European is not something you do, so European is something that you are. Even if it's a gray, what exactly is it in terms of geography, it's not quite clear. For many people, Turkey is already, is not European. It has been acknowledged as European. But strictly speaking, for instance, Iceland is not European in geographical term, but no country ever, no member state ever objected to Iceland. Everybody loves Iceland. Plus, of course, it's very geostrategically located. They are fanatically democratic. They have the oldest democracy in the world since the year 900. They have something recognizable as a parliament there. So complete equality between the sexes as well. It's a fantastic country. It's very small. We hope they will come back. I'll come back to that in a minute. One other, I don't want to talk too much about that, but one other country applied together with Turkey at the time, and there we said, no, sorry, thank you for the compliment of wanting to become a member, but you can never become a member, and that was Morocco. Morocco applied for membership, and we told it, no, you cannot become a member. Why? Because you're not European. Same question goes, sometimes I get the question about Israel. No, it's not European, cannot become a member. This is the question of, are you it or not? No, you're not European. You might have very strong European roots, etc., or European connections, rather. And your Christianity, of course, started as a small Jewish sect in a very obscure part of the Roman Empire. But that does not make Israel European. Okay, no country ever left the EU until 2020. And there's a footnote about Greenland and Algeria, but I'll just skip that for now. So, the new dynamic of enlargement now for the future. I wrote down the list of countries, and in between brackets, there's the date. So for Turkey, 1999, for instance, this was the date when they were accepted as candidate countries by the Council. Now, being a candidate country is a political status awarded by the Council, by the member states, meaning that they think you are now ready to start negotiating. It doesn't mean that actual negotiations take place. With Turkey, nothing much gets done because Turkey has been moving completely away from the other requirements of membership. Iceland suspended negotiations in 2013. I was part of the Iceland team at the time, and our unit was disbanded within 2 weeks because we had nothing more to do. We were extremely disappointed, of course. But now, because of Greenland and because of the uncertainty in the world, they are going to have a referendum this year on membership. And that referendum might well turn out that they would like to start negotiating again. And if they do, they can become a member very, very quickly. So they might come back simply because not the situation in Iceland has not changed, but their completely their geographical or their strategic situation has completely changed. They saw what was happening with Greenland. They saw with the US, they saw what was happening with Russia and Ukraine, etc. There's an old political saying that nothing unites more than the perception of a common enemy. And that seems to be quite working now as well. Not that Iceland has any enemies, but you get the point. This is about the uncertainty that makes you join groups that maybe before you would not have joined so quickly. Bosnia also has gotten candidate status. Bosnia is the most complicated country in the world. I think I can say that with some confidence. And it did not deserve to get candidate country status, but it did get it. And there's a very strong political message behind this here. And this is all linked to Ukraine. Because Ukraine came out of nowhere, so to speak, and got candidate country status very quickly, actually. Now, it's not completely undeserved. They're about the same level as many of the Western Balkan countries that have been preparing for membership for decades already now. But of course, it puts pressure on the Western Balkans, because it would be sort of almost embarrassing for these countries if Ukraine gets in before them, any of them. And the point with Bosnia is that although they didn't deserve it really, in technical terms, they hadn't really done much for this, but now the thinking was, okay, we think you're ready to, or now we are open to negotiations, now the ball is in your court. So now you have to start preparing for that. First question is who is going to represent Bosnia? Very simple question, extremely difficult in the case of Bosnia. But the point is then an award to Bosnia as also as a sign to all the other countries in Western Balkans that we haven't forgotten you. You are still important to us. We still see you becoming a member of the EU. Also when the Ukraine is coming up. So as an extra incentive, there's a bit more competition going on maybe now on that. So that's an important symbol, and I hope that that this message is well received in Bosnia now. Ukraine, like I said, the negotiations have been opened already in 24. And same with Moldova. They might already be closed by 28, at least this is what Ukraine itself now wants, but it's doable. There's a lot of work involved, and I'll come back to that in a minute, what exactly you have to do to become a member. Like I said, there's a lot of work, but the problem is not technical, the problem is political. Because, for instance, you have to work on an independent judiciary, an independent press, anti-corruption measures, all of that, which are politically very difficult. But for Ukraine maybe less so, because they're in a war period and they are in a hurry, of course. So there's much less political resistance against a domination of oligarchs or anti-corruption measures, because they know that this is necessary and there is less political elite resistance, because the political elite will either get arrested or they fled if they were pro-Russian, or there's a lot going on there. They're in a hurry. I mean, they're fighting for their lives, literally. So politically, they're moving very, very fast on this. So by the close of 2028, they might already have completed negotiations. There's even talk about something called reverse enlargement, but I'll talk to that about later. I'll go first to the classical process. Georgia, this is the country I mentioned when I was surprised to hear that they're European. If Georgia is Europe, because I find it difficult to find any historical references to Georgia being part of Europe. And if Georgia is European, then what about Azerbaijan and Armenia? Because they're direct neighbor countries. They're just as European, I think, as Georgia. And don't get me wrong, I think it's a good idea for these countries also to be joining in the end. Because the logic of EU enlargement is basically global. The word European sets the limit, so to speak. But the logic of it, whatever happens in your neighboring country affects you. So it's better to make it a member state because you create some stability there in terms of economic, in terms of rule of law, in terms of economic integration, in terms of governance and democracy. Not that it's politically stable. Look at Italy. That's not really has never been stable very much. But nobody questions the fact that they're a democracy and that there's a rule of law. Sometimes a bit more iffy than others. And we have problems, of course, with Hungary. And before that, we had some problems with Poland and now also maybe with Slovakia. But still, the underlying fundamentals are definitely pretty strong and worth fighting for, even if they're being questioned now in some of the member states. So Georgia has been given the status of candidate country. At the same time, they were moving away from a democracy, from the rule of law, from independent press, etc., etc. So now in the latest annual report of the Commission, it says that the EC, of the European Commission, considers Georgia candidate country in name only. But that is directed to the government. The government is pro-Russian. But it is very clear that about 80% of the population, if not more, is very pro-EU. They see themselves as EU citizens. They want to join, even if their government doesn't. So that means that hopefully democracy will do its work, the democratic system will do its work, and another government will come and replace. The point is, though, that if that happens, when they have their democratic credentials back, they can become a member state because they have been deemed European. How come? Well, they are now candidate country. I think originally the thinking of that was like a poke in the eye of Putin, without the member states really thinking this through, because suddenly Georgia was considered European, and under normal circumstances I don't think that would have happened. But now they cannot undo this. You cannot say, oh no, sorry, you're not European, you're not a candidate country. This is a one-way thing, a ratchet effect. Once you've stated that, there's no going back. And in itself, I don't think it's a bad thing, but like I said, Armenia and Azerbaijan might follow. And this is not completely unthinkable. I mean, they haven't applied for membership yet, but they have their own problems with Russia and with each other, but especially with Russia. So they might well consider that this is a division of risk, maybe play of Russia against the EU on that, or they don't see a future for themselves with Russia, but they do see a future for themselves with the EU. Most citizens in those countries usually see themselves much rather as EU citizens rather than citizens aligned with Russia. Of course, I mean, it's their choice, but I can see it completely happening, and it will be interesting to see how the Council is going to react to that after you already said that Georgia is a European country. There's one other thing, but okay, Kosovo, which is very, very interesting from a European perspective kind of thing. So Kosovo is a potential candidate. It is not called a potential candidate country. And that is very deliberately so. And it refers to a very old, very deep historical issue with Europe. First of all, it's not called a country because 5 of the member states in the EU do not recognize Kosovo as a country for their own reasons. Those countries, it's Cyprus, Greece, Spain, Romania, and I think Slovakia, for different reasons. The reason, but the main historical reason that I refer to is the following. Kosovo was part of Serbia. It declared itself independent and applied for membership. Clearly, they wanted to be acknowledged as a nation state because it's only nation states that become a member of the EU, not regions, not cities, nation state. If you become a member, this is an ultimate historical political acknowledgement that indeed you are a European nation state. So, here we have then part of a country that declares itself independent and applies for membership. This makes member states very nervous, some of the member states, because every country in Europe has regions that feel themselves more independent, historically speaking, than the rest of the country. Think Bayern in Germany, think Pays Catalan or Catalonia and what's the other one?
Basque country.
Yes, Basque country that think of themselves, that would like to be independent, or at least there's a movement of that. In France you would have Corsica and Bretagne. In the Netherlands you would have Friesland. Sweden, I think, also has a region there. Finland has one. When you start thinking about that, every member state has some regions that think that way. So, the thinking is, well, if we acknowledge Kosovo as a nation state, what is to stop any part of our own country to declare itself independent and apply for membership? The UK had problems with Scotland and maybe Wales. So, you know, this is not a theoretical problem. This is a very real deep issue throughout Europe, because Europe for a long time was a Europe of cities and regions. The concept of a nation state is very recent. It started especially in the 19th century. Well, it started in the 17th century, but it came especially with the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. So it has really deep historical roots. It really touches a raw nerve for many member states. So they feel if we acknowledge Kosovo as a member state, they don't care about Kosovo. It has nothing to do with Kosovo. It has to do with their own country, their own regions. So there's a problem there. Now, the criteria, other than that you have to be European, you have to have stability of institutions, meaning you have to have a democracy, rule of law, protection of minorities. That's a big thing. You have to have a functioning market economy. This was especially problematic, of course, for the new member states in 2004, because they had basically centrally planned economies with a one-party system. And they had to move away towards a more democratic system and a market economy. And many of these countries had never had a market economy, especially Bulgaria and Romania. So they had to be taught, how does a market economy work? It's not so simple. And the last one is the ability to take on the obligations of membership. What does that mean? And this is the technical issue that I spoke about earlier. You have to completely adjust all your laws to EU law. So you have to make a complete comparison of every national law that you have, and also local level and regional level, and check whether it's compatible with EU law. Now, to give you an idea, EU law is about 170,000 pages of law, depending on which language. In English it's shorter, in Hungarian it's longer, but give or take, 170,000 pages. First you need to translate that. This is not Google Translate, this is a legal translation. And then you check your laws with the EU law. And then if any of your laws are not compatible with EU law, you have to change your law. This is basically non-negotiable. The principle, I mean, this is a lot of work, and you can already see the political impact of this. Although the principle is very straightforward. You want to become a member of a club, you sign up to the rules of the club. You're not going to debate the rules. You're not going to say, well, that rule I like to follow and that rule I can't. No. That's not how you become a member. It's just that, of course, there's a lot of rules. Obviously. There is a problem there. But on the other hand, the principle stands clear. And like I said, basically this is non-negotiable. There's some small print to that, sure. But that is the technical and especially the largest political issue of membership. But on the other hand, a lot of countries have done it. So, you won't be the first one. You will get a lot of help, technical help from member states, from the Commission, etc. But it's a big thing to swallow. You can see that. There's one thing maybe I also want to mention, that the EU is a community of values. Values stick out all over the place. These criteria for membership clearly reflect a lot of values. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're aware that these are values. And they were, by the way, they were only formulated in 1993. This is pretty late, but it was already clear, for instance, Spain, Portugal and Greece could not become a member. They applied for membership while they were still military dictatorships. And the EEC told them at the time, no, you can't become a member because you're not democracies. You have to be a democracy and then you can apply. But it has to be a democratic decision in the first place to apply for membership. So you cannot say, well, I'm not a democracy now, but I will be on day one of membership. That doesn't, because the decision to apply must be democratically taken as well. But it was in the early 90s that it was finally formulated. Again, no coincidence, because this was after the Berlin Wall had fallen. So now we had to deal with a lot of state systems that had no democratic history and no market economy history. So this was, so it had to be made clear now, explicit, something that was already implicit a long time before. But it's good that it was finally made explicit. So now you can talk about it and debate it. There's one value, and I always point this out, there's one value that is not, it sticks out like a sore thumb in how it is not present. It does not say anything about religion. For very, very good European historical reasons. Need I remind people of the 30-year war and the Reformation and the endless religious wars in Europe. Suppose it would say Christian. So we're not even going to go to Protestant or Catholic or Lutheran or Zwinglian or whatever. I mean, hundreds of different branches within Christianity. Just Christian. That's all. If it would say that, then guess what? Of course, Turkey is out. But then Bosnia-Herzegovina and Albania can no longer become a member either. You see where that goes very quickly. And you want to get away from that. And I'm not saying that religion and faith are not important. They are very important. But it gets, as soon as you start talking religion, you get on a personal value level extremely quickly. And like I said, so this is where you get away from that by not mentioning it here. The only context in which religion is mentioned in the body of European Union law is in the context of freedom of expression. Your religion is your own business, and that will be your right to exert that will be protected. That's it. Nothing else. Whether the country itself, and it was interesting when in 73 Spain, Portugal and Greece became a member, so there's two Catholic and an Orthodox country. And there was some talk about, is it a good idea of having all of these countries join what at that time was perceived as a Protestant club. By the way, the Treaty of Rome in 1957, when the EEC was founded, in 1957, it was considered by many a Roman Catholic plot. Why? Because the 6 ministers of foreign affairs who signed the treaty were all Roman Catholics. Now that might have been complete coincidence or not. And of course it says Treaty of Rome. That's already suspicious if you're not Catholic. You know, so you see how that always comes back. 2004, Roman Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox countries joined. Nobody made a point of that. This is how far we had come in the meantime already. But it is never far from the service. By the way, same with immigration. There was a lot of talk in immigration of, again, 73, Spain, Portugal, and, no, it's not 73, 81, 85, of course, Spain, Portugal, and Greece entering. Whether all these Spanish and Greeks and Portuguese would not come and steal our jobs and date our women and whatever. No? Now, then with 2004, it was suddenly Poles and other people from the new member states. My point here is that the discussions never change. It's just the names that change. Now we talk maybe about huge immigration from Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, has basically the same population as Poland now, about 39 million inhabitants. So, you know, we've dealt with this before. And that's also why I'm always hammer so much on history, because it provides perspective. So that a lot of the issues we're dealing with, we have been dealing with in the past as well. And look how we dealt with it, what worked, what didn't work. And maybe there's less concern then about immigration flows, because we've been dealing with that for a long time with each enlargement. So, like I said, it gives perspective. Now, this is just very briefly, this is an overview of the body of European Union law. It's 35 chapters. Basically, it's and the first idea is, well, this is everything in the kitchen sink. It covers a lot. For the countries that want to enter, especially the red ones, 23, 24 chapters, those are very important. Those are politically usually the most difficult ones. You have to get these right, and then we can talk about the other ones. These are usually the ones that take longest in terms of negotiations. And you have to build a track record as well for in terms of anti-corruption measures. People actually have to get arrested. And not just on paper, it has to be correctly implemented as well. You build a track record. Now, just very briefly as a question, well, what is being enlarged? What is the European Union? It's not such an easy question, actually. Jacques Delors, the former Commission president, he once likened the EU as a UPO, an unidentified political object. I think this is as good as a definition as you're ever going to get on the EU. There's simply no precedent for this. Number of independent, sovereign, democratic nation states that voluntarily choose to start sharing sovereignty to unprecedented degrees. This has never been done in world history or European history. Like I said, there's no precedent for it. It's a very, very strange kind of construct that we have here. And it seems to be working, but when you look at it from a very technical point of view, it's a very odd kind of thing. And this integration and the enlargement has three elements for it. First of all, modern integration, modern European integration is economic integration, above all. So not forced. This is not the Roman Empire. And you can take any lesson that you want from history. And I think one of the lessons you can take most usefully from European history is that Europe cannot be united by force. And we have a long and very bloody history to prove it. So this is a completely different kind of integration. It's economic integration through the single market, a free flow of goods, services, capital, and people. That's the thinking. It's a means to an end, because the project is highly political. But the means to an end is economics. Through trade, through investment, through cooperation, knowledge sharing, etc., you create interdependence. And therefore, your former enemy is now your client, is now your colleague. This is where your factory is, this is who you sell your cars to, or your wine, or whatever. Of course, it would be naive to think that it could ever really completely prevent war, but you make it extremely costly to do so. And in the meantime, you work with each other. And it's very difficult to keep up that level of hatred if you work with each other every day. I think, in any case. So, it's economic integration. With also more and more, there's a lot more scope now in terms of social inclusion, of UN Sustainable Development Goals, of European Pillar of Social Rights, in terms of healthcare. Not strictly economic anymore, it has been expanding, this kind of cooperation, which I think is a very good thing. It's usually driven by crisis, by the way. Because healthcare is strictly member state competence only until COVID. And now member states start to cooperate with the European Commission. And the Commission is now dealing with defense, which is also completely strange until, it was very strange until Russia then invaded Ukraine. So that's the first thing, economic integration. Second thing is, and this is a very European thing that I discovered working at the Commission. Europeans are obsessed with rules. The Americans have it too, but I think that's their European heritage. We are obsessed with rules. And there's one thing in European history as well that we usually always agree on. Rules should be applied equally to everybody. This has the roots of that are basically Christian and Enlightenment. And the Christian thinking is you have your own personal responsibility toward your God. You will be judged not on the basis of your clan or your family or your skin color or your sex or your height or weight or whatever. You as an individual will be judged. And everybody will be judged the same way. Doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, etc. In theory, at least. Now, this is an extremely important concept That is reflected as well in the body of European Union law. The rules should be applied equally to everybody, whether you're a small member state or a big member state, should not matter. Now in practice, maybe some are more equal than others, but the differences between small member states and big member states, this is not what divides them. It's usually issues that divide them or unite them. If you have a steel industry, for instance, in small Luxembourg or big Germany, there you have something in common. Size doesn't really enter into it. And the EU is designed in such a way that the bigger member states have far less in terms of votes than the smaller member states. And the system is designed in such a way that the big member states cannot force the smaller member states, nor can the smaller member states band together and force the big member states. You have to cooperate. The system is very strictly designed that way. And this is also one of the reasons of why this is attracted to smaller countries. Because one of the reasons is you don't want to be dominated by your big neighbors anymore. Well, in the EU, you don't. Sometimes you hear, say, yeah, well, Germany is dominating everything. Well, what do you think Germany was doing before the EU? You know, so dominating, well, yes, it has a big voice, but on the other hand, it is bound by these acquis communautaire rules, like everybody else. And bound maybe even more because it's so big and everybody was nervous about Germany for a long time of their history. For good reasons, I might add. But now, if Germany has a big voice, fine. It still cannot dominate, it cannot do anything without the smaller member states. Same for France, of course. Or any of the other countries. So, economic integration within a framework of rules that we're obsessed by, but this is, like I said, deep historical roots. And the third, of course, the whole project is extremely political. This is a political project, not an economic project or a rule. It's rule-based, but it's all a reflection of the political end goal. Now, what the end goal is in the treaties, they only talk about ever closer union of the peoples, which is a pretty smart way of putting it, actually. It does not say a federal Europe, because countries do not want to become a member in order to become provinces of the EU. They become a member because they feel it's in their own interest to do so, right? And they do not want to lose their nation state status by becoming a member. They want it protected. So the treaty says ever closer union, which means it's a process. It doesn't say where it ever ends, if it ever ends. Usually it stops when the member states say, okay, this is far enough, no more. And then a crisis occurs and then they move up again. This works like going to the dentist. This is how I always describe it. So you don't go to the, nobody really likes to go to the dentist, so you don't go to the dentist. Who cares? Nobody cares. One morning you wake up with toothache. Now you go to the dentist. Why? Because now the choice is no longer between a little pain, going to the dentist, and no pain, because you don't go to the dentist. Now the choice is between a lot of pain, going to the dentist, and even more pain, not going to the dentist. So you let the dentist invade the sovereignty of your mouth, if that's how you want to see it. So meaning, a crisis makes politically thinkable and possible what before was impossible. You saw it with Ukraine. Because before that, if Ukraine under normal circumstances would have applied for membership, member states would have not gone for it. In 2016 there was a referendum in the Netherlands, actually, about the association agreement, which does not mean that a country is becoming a member, but it was soundly rejected in the Netherlands, based, by the way, on a lot of Russian misinformation, etc. But now everybody wants the Ukraine in. Well, Hungary has its political problems with it, or the Hungarian government, but you get the principle. Things become politically possible with a crisis that they were impossible before. You see, and this is actually also how the EU operates. The EU does not exist the EU does not exist despite crisis, it exists because of crisis. Crisis drives integration. The EU itself is founded based on the crisis after the First and Second World War, where member states try to, or countries try to destroy each other and its own citizens. And that was never going to happen. That should not have ever happen again. So now they start to cooperate in unprecedented degrees that was unthinkable because it was completely incompatible with total sovereignty of a member state. And you saw that happen. And every crisis drives this kind of integration further, actually. It's almost like integration by stealth, but at the same time it's open and for all to see. So this political objective is ever closer union, whatever that means, but it does set up a kind of thinking that this is not simply a bunch of loose member states that can leave whenever they want. It's a lot more than that. And then I already mentioned very briefly now some of the reason, why does any country want to become a member? I already said 170,000 pages of law text. The average time between application for membership and actual membership, entry into the EU, is 8 to 10 years, historically speaking. There's a lot to do with the 170,000 pages, but also with the political willingness to actually go through all of that. So why would any country want to do that? And you will find very little in the literature, everything together. So I try to do that for myself. And I put it in historical, economic, and political reasons. A lot of them already mentioned, actually. So the historical, one of the things what I always find interesting is that it's almost like a paradox in European integration thinking. Like a red thread through European history, there's this idea of a European unity. It already started, the roots of that are Roman Empire, basically, but also but also Christianity. We're all Christians and therefore we should all be united. A Christian Commonwealth. Before that was the Roman Empire. It's linked, actually. At the same time, we all want to be respected for our own unique culture and language and circumstances and history. So there's this paradox. At the same time, one rule for everybody, we agree on that, but we disagree on who makes the rules. That's the rub, actually. Because my God obviously is better than your God, so we should all follow my God. And of course the other guy thinks exactly the same thing. The concept of the same rule for everybody is clear. But the point was always who makes the rules. That's where the war started. Is it Charlemagne, is it Napoleon, is it Hitler, or is it my own democratically elected government? Whatever. That's where the problem starts. But the thinking about a united Europe runs like a red thread through European history. And like I said, the one thing that has been proved is you cannot unite Europe by force. The thinking behind it is we should all be united. Of course, under the leadership of Charlemagne or Hitler or Kaiser Wilhelm or whatever. That came then on top of that. But the principle was clear in terms of this dream of unity that came back all the time. There's the economic. Okay, well, there's one very short caricature of European integration, modern integration, is that the EU was founded to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. That already shows you the different kind of elements that played a role. And this was also very much Cold War time. The US, until Trump, always supported European integration. Why? Well, they had their own interest to do so. They wanted the big market. And they wanted a rich Europe that could pay for their own part of their own defense. Economically speaking, already mentioned, you enter a big market, a very highly developed market. Economically, there is no question about the positive effects. The economic effects of the coming enlargements, say all of the Western Balkans join and Ukraine join. The Western Balkans is about 16 million inhabitants. It's very small. It's about 3.5% of EU population. So that's not going to make much of a difference to the EU itself as a market. For those countries, however, it's going to have a huge impact. When Ireland became a member in '73, it was one of the poorest countries in Europe. And now it is one of, well, formally speaking, one of the richest countries in Europe in terms of per capita and GDP. Spain had a fantastic economic run after it became a member. Really good, very impressive. So for those countries, it makes a huge difference. Why? Because suddenly all investors, international investors, know that Spain is going to follow the EU rules and they They know the EU rules. They've been working with that for years. And international companies know those rules. And now Spain has that credibility of the rule of law following EU laws. Suddenly, the market becomes transparent and very interesting. Ukraine is about the size of Poland, as I said. Again, for the EU itself, it will make some difference, but especially for the countries entering. The per capita income of the Western Balkans, roughly speaking, is about 40% of the EU GDP, 40% of EU average. In Ukraine, but that's a bit of an unfair comparison, of course, because of the wartime, it's about 15%. So you can count on a huge economic flight. Once it becomes a member, of course, there's a lot of the end of the hostilities of the war, etc., etc. But economically, there's a huge potential there. That's clear, of which the rest of the EU countries would then also profit. The country needs to be rebuilt, for instance. And a lot of the laws that they have are already compatible with EU laws. So there's a lot of attraction in terms of economic potential development. More so for the country itself as for the EU, but still, like I said, Ukraine will turn the EU into an agricultural powerhouse, by the way. Just a bit like with Poland. There's a lot of interesting parallels with Poland, actually. So, political reasons for membership. I already mentioned the elephant argument. You sit at a table where the decisions are being made that are going to hugely affect you. So you want to be part of that. There's also the acknowledgement, both historical and political, that yes, you are a nation state. You have now secure borders. Your neighbors, who probably also are going to be member state or are already member state, will now treat you differently. I remember an Irish government official telling us about the shock that he delivered once Ireland became a member, that suddenly they were treated as full nation states in Brussels, not longer as the little brothers of the UK, because their main relationship was with the UK, of course. But now suddenly they were considered adults in the room because they were a nation state, not just the smaller brother of the UK. And that was a complete cultural shock to them, to be treated that such a way. And for other countries, just as much. They're no longer the small nephews or the small neighbors of big member states. No, they are nation states in themselves, and they have an equal say in Brussels. So that makes a big impact on not only on the economics, but also the whole political perception of the countries. And it allows them to pursue objectives that they can no longer or could never pursue by themselves. And in that term, because there's a lot of talk about loss of sovereignty when a country becomes a member, state, because they can no longer then make their own laws. Those laws, a lot of those laws are now made together with all the other member states. Well, the Commission proposes them, but the Council decides. The member states decide. And I can see the argument. By the way, it also touches a raw nerve that populists use. Brussels decide. We will not let Brussels tell us what we do. That's a completely false representation of the issue. Because what is Brussels? Brussels, who decides in Brussels? The member states that decide in Brussels, together with the directly elected European Parliament. So it's not like, if it's good, I did it. If it's bad, it's in Brussels. That's usually how politicians sell it. But the politicians don't say that they were in Brussels with the other ministers and they decided on that. No. That part they don't mention. But back on the sovereignty part then. One remark is on this. Sovereignty is not the right to act. I think sovereignty is the ability to act. As a small country, you can have all the right in the world to act, but nobody's going to pay attention to you. And in the meantime, your big neighbors, in effect, tell you what to do and how to live your life, because they can force it on you. So that's where is the sovereignty in that. Now you become a member of a club, you become a member of the elephant, now you get more respect. Not only of the other part of the elephant, but also toward other elephants like China. Or when small Lithuania speaks with China, it speaks with China as a member state of the EU, a representative of the EU, rather than being bullied by any other country, because it knows it is part of the elephant. And second of all, that sovereignty, you can also look at it this way. Almost every crisis that the EU has to deal with, climate, China, US, Russia, immigration, which is actually more of a political crisis than an economic crisis, if you ask me. But all of these crises would also have happened without the EU. Yeah, a country has to deal with it one way or the other. Then it's better to deal with it as member of the EU than as a small country on your own. You try to there's a cooperation, you try to minimize the shock and the depth of the shock jointly rather than as a small country, because most countries in the EU are small to medium-sized countries. So the sovereignty debate touches a raw nerve, because throughout history, smaller, big regions, bigger powers have always tried to subjugate the smaller regions. So that touches a nerve that populists completely use. I get it. And now it's Brussels, so to speak. So that is very understandable, but that's also why modern European integration is completely different. But it's still, we will not let Brussels tell us how to live our lives. People usually really go into that, go for that. And like I said, and they go for that because of the European history and the bad experiences they've had for a few thousand years. So it's completely understandable. And that's also why it's important. No, this is a completely different beast. And the sovereignty, we had to ask, for instance, we sometimes got questions from Iceland as well. Iceland is 320,000 inhabitants on a country that is larger than Ireland, actually. And they asked us, well, aren't we going to be completely dominated by the other member states? No, it doesn't work like that. You can have a decisive voice in important issues. And for instance, like on geothermal energy or sustainable fishing or things like that, or they know their business on those kind of things. But in any kind of voting, small countries usually are very good at making coalitions, for instance. They've done that in order to survive, and they can put it to good use in the EU as well. Okay, listen, I'm nearly done. I know this is a lot. The cost of membership, I list that. So the small print. Yeah, political, economic, historical costs of membership. There's this unavoidable sense of loss of sovereignty. No matter what I say, it will always be there. It will always be a political point. And populists will always hammer on that. Because it works. So, like I said, there's good counter-arguments, but it's a cost, it's a perceived cost. You have to contribute to the EU budget, which is actually very small. It's about 1% of your GDP. Now, consider what you pay into the national government budget. It's about, on average, 40–45% of GDP. It's very small. But there's a cost, sure. All of that. And the perception, well, there's one real cost after all, I think. Now, the fear of gridlock. We started with 6 member states. Now we have 27. In the coming 5 to 10 years, we might have 35 member states. How do you still make decisions in a meaningful, rapid way? And that is a real issue. So far, though, decision-making has not noticeably slowed down. And we went from 6 to 9 to 12 to 15, 28, 27. Decision-making processes have not really slowed down a lot, which is quite remarkable, actually, because it's almost counterintuitive. But it has to do with the fact that member states see the point of cooperation most of the time, and the voting system is also designed in such a way that there's strong incentives to cooperate. Not always, obviously, but in practice it works. There's a lot more I can say about that, but just stick to that for now. The process does not seem to be hindered by adding member states. Member states are acutely aware of this problem as well, by the way. This is one of their big fears, and you don't want to become a member of a club and then make the club unworkable because you are now a member, because there's too many votes now or too many vetoes. So, the issues now that we still have to deal with, but I mean, you know them as well as I do. Yeah, Russia, Ukraine war, China, US, energy, climate, public health, pandemics. Because it's not a matter. We will get pandemics again. Historically, it's not a matter of if. It's always a matter of when. The legacy of the economic crisis. There's a real issue there, by the way, and this is also partly, in economic terms, responsible for the rise of populism. Populism usually rises after financial crisis, because the hatred of banks, which I completely understand, by the way, and also what has been going on for the last 20 years at least, is that the wealth, the disproportionate wealth in the hands of an increasingly smaller number of people. A very skewed, completely outrageous wealth distribution. That is a recipe for social unrest. And it's completely gone overboard. In Europe, it's not quite as bad as in the US or a few other countries, but still, it has been happening. And what also happened at the same time is, until the 1990s, 2000s, every younger generation could count on the fact that they would be better off than the older generation. And that stopped being true for the last 20 years or so. So now there was until that time, there was a positive sum thinking. You gain, but I gain as well. And now the thinking is, what you gain is my loss. And it's not unreasonable to think that. And so people feel, they feel left out, especially younger generations. Look at the housing crisis, for instance. And that is a real issue, and like I said, that really plays into the hands of populists, and is a danger also for integration thinking, absolutely. So there's an issue that really needs serious consideration. We have a demographic problem, by the way. The population of the EU is going to decline. In the Western Balkans, it's going to decline massively, 20% in the coming decades. Romania, Bulgaria as well, they will lose about 20-25% of the population in the coming decades. And the labor market in the EU is already declining, meaning that more and more people reach the age of 65, they're no longer part of the labor, and they're not being replaced. There's a real issue there. Completely flies in the face of the logic of anti-immigration, by the way. Immigration cannot be the complete answer, but it's part of the answer. And the countries that need it most, like Hungary, they're the most opposed to immigration. Go figure. Economically, it does not make any sense at all. But okay, I'm not here now to offer answers to that. I just note the problem. So population aging is also well, it's not a problem. I mean, actually, it's a fantastic thing. It testifies to the quality of life in societies, that people live longer and more healthy and productive lives. 65, by the way, the age of pension, comes from Bismarck, Germany in the 19th century. Why was the age of 65 chosen? Very Machiavellian. 65 was the age by which most people would be dead. Because they work in the mines and the steel industry and dirty and dangerous work, and your body was gone by that time. Now 65 is the new 40, as far as I'm concerned. But societies have to pay for that, of course. It's an achievement of society to have that. So in that sense, it's not a problem. But of course, there's issues then to deal with. How do you pay for that, etc., healthcare, all of that. So there's an issue there that we need to deal with. So this is the last slide. There's this fantastic quote from Jean Monnet. Nobody knows exactly when he said that. It's I think probably in 1950s that he said this. But it is as true now as it was then, as it ever was. So Europe is forged in crisis and will be the result of all the decisions that you take in crisis. Like I said, crisis drives integration. Maybe this is completely counterintuitive, but this is indeed how it works. And maybe in a way, thank God that it does. Because otherwise the EU would not have survived very long. It's sad and bad that you actually need a crisis to do what you should have been doing all the way. Think the dentist. If you just should have gone to the dentist for control regularly, you would not have needed that crisis to finally move your butt and go to the dentist. That's how it works, that you need a crisis to do that. But okay, this is in practice. Member states think exactly the same. They need a crisis to do what is politically, what should have been done already a long time before. But I think it's a very powerful quote. And the thing is, though, as long as you don't take for granted what the EU has achieved so far and still can and will and should achieve, you're still going to be okay. The thing is, as soon as you take anything for granted, you can no longer enjoy it. You no longer perceive it until it's in danger, like things like democracy and the right to vote and the rule of law and free press and all of that. The moment that starts being threatened, you really should pay attention to that. When you take it for granted, you can no longer, like I said, you can no longer protect it even because it's just there until it isn't. So I think as long as you don't take it for granted, I think the EU is going to be okay. And this is a very positive message. And of course, and the Commission, I was paid to be optimistic. I get that. But I truly do believe it. There's a very strong track record and very strong arguments for the survival of the EU, I think. So, sorry, I've been hitting you with a baseball bat. It's way too much time. But at least I hope you got an idea, I think, of the EU. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Willem. And it actually worked out well because I want to take questions now. I just received a message. The ambassador of Sierra Leone's outside. The Minister of Tourism and Culture had cancelled this morning because her flight, there was a problem because of the flights, this and that. She's here. She wants to come. So she's on her way. They'd like a little bit more time. So therefore, that if it's okay with you all, I would say let's take some questions, discussion. The ambassador's there. He wants to wait until the minister's here before we begin. But let's have some questions, discussion, then we can take a brief break, probably at around 5:15 or so. I think we're planning to begin the session with Sierra Leone. But it's great that the minister's coming because she's the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Planning. She was actually 3 different ministers in Sierra Leone, so a great example also of women leadership. So something to look forward to. But now let's take the questions and the comments. I think it was a very excellent and a very precise explanation of where we are today with the European Union, how we got here, and I think is really a very, very powerful example as we look around the world at many other multilateral situations that are obviously eyeing the European Union as an example. What can they learn? What can be applied? So the floor is yours now. Questions and comments. As always, if you can raise your hand and then briefly introduce yourself. Yes, we'll start in the back. Okay.
Good afternoon. I am having the habit of calling the professor, and you also gave a really good lecture, so it seems like you are a professor at the moment for us. So I will call you professor, sorry for that. So professor, I was wondering, Germany and the France, they were having really in hot water for so long in the history. So I am always wondering, I even asked my other professors also, what was the reason and how they convinced each other to come together on one platform and start this corporation or start this organization EU. I'm really not able to be getting the exact answer. So, and I'm also wondering, if they are getting together, there should be some benefit for them at that time, if not in the present, but in previous time. So they need some benefit out of it. Only then they wanted to join each other because everyone wants to show their supremacy on the other one. Yeah. So I want to know how they able to do it.
I mean, Germany at the time, well, first of all, the concept of a nation state was very heavily damaged in the Second World War because it was nation states that had attacked each other, nation states that tried to kill each other's and their own citizens. And it was the US that came in as a big savior. United States of America. So there was a lot of thinking we should have a United States of Europe. Now, Germany Germany wanted to atone for its sins, and they had a lot to atone for, of course. So this was like a hand reached out, that is European Coal and Steel Community. So this was an idea for which the time was ripe. France had lost its empire. This was also one of the reasons Germany had lost, obviously, its empire. France also had lost its empire. The UK, by the way, also. I mean, all of the countries lost their empires. The thinking in France was, we need to rise again. We can lead Europe, but not through war, through economics, through politics, and Germany can pay for it. And Germany wanted to pay because this was a way to atone. There was even, originally there was some thinking that Germany should not be part of the European Economic Community because it has proven that it was no longer considered, it could no longer be considered as a Western civilization. But that was completely against the point of the whole EEC, because the original thinking was to bind Germany, not only Germany, but especially Germany, to prevent it from ever going to war again. Hence first coal and steel community and later expanded. So Germany wanted this. They wanted to be acknowledged again as a nation state, admitting the mistakes, the horrible crimes of the past. So in order to do that, they had to, or they wanted to accept. This was like a hand's offer to them to help them get up. The hand was offered not because everybody loved, they all hated Germany. They were all afraid of Germany. But they also knew, if we keep Germany down, this is not going to be a peace like after the First World War. This is just going to be a truce again until there is, until Germany rises again, maybe as a military power. You don't know. You have no control. We want to control it. How do we control it? We bind it with European Union rules or EEC rules. So Germany had a strong incentive to accept this. They wanted to leave all of that memory behind. They know they had a long road to go and they could never do it alone. They had to prove to everybody else that they were willing and open to do this. And of course they also were undergoing what was called an economic miracle. They grew extremely fast after the Second World War, like Japan. And there's good reasons for that. And France wanted to keep a very strong control on Germany after what it had gone through and politically lead. So they could do that with Germany paying, they in the lead, and also the other countries like the Netherlands or Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, they also wanted their own share and they had suffered a lot as well. So France knew, okay, we cannot do this alone. And there was some very enlightened thinking from Schuman, from these fathers of European integration thinking. The time was right for that because nation states could no longer do it on their own. They were completely discredited. So there was incentives on both sides, so to speak, to start cooperating. And the thinking was not, well, I like you, so I want to cooperate. No, I hate you and I'm afraid of you, so that's why we need to cooperate. Because I need to know what you're doing. Like I said, the saying was, you keep your friends close, you keep your enemies closer. It's a very pragmatic way to get out of this huge mess and devastation, because Europe was in ruins at the time. So, so that was the thinking that lied behind it. And it proved to be extremely successful. The thinking was, we need to do, because the old ways can no longer be there. We lost our empires, we lost our country, or the country is devastated. We need to come up with something new. And like I said, the original thinking was as well a United States of Europe. For many people, that was a dream at the time. Didn't stay a dream for very long, but it was a dream. And it offered a good alternative, of course, to countries fighting, because they didn't have the energy anymore and they were gone and Germany was completely defeated. So I hope that makes sense for you.
Yeah, I got
Okay.
it. Thank
Okay.
you.
Please.
So first of all, that was a wonderful speech, and in particular, great use of analogies, a lot of which were hilarious. I'm not sure if you agree with that adjective, but at least it kept us.
Yeah, no. This is the kind of
very
thing that
engaged.
sticks in your mind. The dentist, the elephant,
Yes.
those images stick there.
The one that I found the most interesting was, of course, the UPO.
Mm-hmm.
And great analogy, but I wonder if this UPO
Yeah.
is only visible in the sky to countries that have strategic and maybe geopolitical goals and strategies that
Mhm.
align very closely with the key decision makers in the EU.
Yeah.
Because to me it would seem that for all the talk about being European as a prerequisite for inclusion into the EU,
Mhm.
and for having deep economic ties with the with the region under the EU as being primary requisites for membership,
Yeah.
it is still pretty egregious to me how some very key states are conspicuous by their absence. Switzerland, Norway,
Yes.
UK, of course, did something which is a self-inflicted wound. So I'm not going to go into the UK's membership question, but Switzerland, Norway, Andorra, Monaco.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Small
several key
microstates.
states which I don't think will leave doubts about Europeanness in anyone's minds, and also deep economic ties with all the existing member states.
Yeah.
So I wonder if this UPO is only visible to some states which want to see it, and some states whose long-term strategies align with those of the EU, and not to the rest.
Well, I mean, within Europe, you mentioned microstates. All of the microstates have very close cooperation with the EU. They don't want to become a member. The EU doesn't want them to become a member either. But for instance, countries like Monaco is also run indirectly by France. And basically they're part of the single market too. So all of their laws are compatible with the EU, etc. So they have very good cooperation agreements. Switzerland just signed a whole series of renewed contracts with the EU on cooperation. Again, the point is the same for Norway. You know, they have to follow EU laws because otherwise they don't have access, but they don't have a voice. But it is still, they still think, okay, we want to stay as an independent sovereign nation state. We're not going to become a member. It is not excluded that one day they will become a member. Internationally speaking, I remember inquiries at the time from ASEAN on, you know, the setup of the EU, because of course, I mean, sure, it is unique, but nothing prevents other countries from doing exactly the same thing. Yeah? What is usually the big stumbling block is when they see how decisions are taken jointly and have legal force. It is not just a free trade area where you can come in and out as you please. No, there's much more going to that. But ASEAN was very interested. Again, then sovereignty is an issue for all countries in the world. Right? So they say, okay, we explain this is how it works in the EU. Feel free to use this as a blueprint because, of course, every country's situation is unique, the culture is unique, the history is unique. So, but I think it would be extremely arrogant to say, well, this can only work in Europe. I think that's complete nonsense. We did it first, but feel free to, I think the EU would be delighted actually to have this kind of model exported to the rest of the world. I said the only problem is, yes, you have to start sharing sovereignty to a really high degree. Look what that gives you, but it's a long way to go. You have to swallow a lot of, in a sense, political pride, so to speak. And if that's ever going to happen, I don't know. But I hope that the UPO, yeah, it's great if the UPO would, you know, turn into several UPOs for that. It's hard to, this is very hard to predict. But so far, and there's a lot of regional organizations, by the way, yeah? There's a few dozen. Also in Latin America, in Africa, Middle East, exactly. So the example is there, it works, feel free to use it. For many countries, it's still a step too far. Maybe they need also more of a crisis, I don't know, to get there, if they ever will get there. But it is their own national sovereign decision to do so. And again, the EU still stands, I think, as a very positive example. By the way, maybe also remark there, the EU is often accused of being weak and indecisive. Especially the Soviet Union and Russia still think that. And I think the opposite is true, because what we have here, Europe is defined by diversity. And like in nature, diversity provides resilience. If you have a very diverse natural environment, that means if a disaster strikes, that there's more chance that 1 or 2 or 3 species will survive, because even if others are hit, but it's not just one species, and if it's not there, everything is gone. It's the same for the EU. This diversity provides resilience in time of crisis. It's like a laboratory. We have 10 different ways of thinking and 10 different ways of doing things. Maybe one way works better in this crisis than the other way. And that's how you create resilience. So this diversity is actually something that is very valuable. And in terms of indecisiveness, well, first, this is the price you pay for democracy. There's not one strong man who makes a decision and now we all do that. At the same time, COVID and the economic crisis linked with that and the health crisis have shown, and Russia, with the Russian invasion, to try to move away from Russian oil and energy very fast, actually. So, so the indecisiveness, I heard once a very nice comparison with that as well, in the same style as the dentist and the elephant and the UPO. Member states are sometimes, it's looking at a flock of birds across the road, and they're just circling and circling and don't seem to go anywhere. They just circle. And a few hours later, they're still circling, but they're also a mile down the road. That's also how this often goes. They seem to be going nowhere, but in the meantime, the circling is part of the decision-making process and they are getting somewhere. But in first instance, it looks like completely indecisive and it takes forever, etc., etc. And I get where that comes from, but in practice so far, it has been actually shown to be quite effective on its own democratic terms. Okay. Any other questions? Or please. You have the mic? There. Yeah, you can. Exactly. I mean, I don't.
So my question is in regards to, okay, the EU, you have to be European, right? But obviously you said that is kind of subjective and that definition changes as things go. And it's not really geographical anymore, obviously, as much as it moves east, and then we talk about Iceland, and then I think there was even Canada was like debating it with everything happening in North America. So in that case, do you think the line, if there even is one, like when does it become, okay, no, definitively you are not European, or because it's such a kind of becoming more subjective and it changes and it's dynamic?
Yeah,
when is the...
like I said, I mean, I think the lines are still definitely geographic, but the geography has never been defined. Iceland, we have two member states, by the way, where you also could have asked the questions whether they're European or not, and that never was raised, Malta and Cyprus. But I think that had to do with the fact that Malta was 420,000 inhabitants and Cyprus has 900,000 inhabitants, and it's almost like, who cares? It's so small. Same with Iceland. Imagine Turkey to be the size of Slovenia, 2 million inhabitants. I think then suddenly the problem would disappear for most people. That it's not Christian, not like us, whatever. So, and sometimes you get the question, well, almost the whole world at one stage or another was a colony of one of the European powers. I think only Myanmar was and the Arctics were never really colonized. The thought is actually in a way beautiful if they all could become a member. Fantastic. But like I said, the limits are given by the political decision of the member states. And I myself was very surprised that Georgia was deemed European. I mean, I'm not against it. Georgia should become a member. I was just very surprised. Okay, never thought of Georgia as European. So circumstances shift. Maybe it's also, then it's a ratchet effect. Once you've said it's a candidate country, it's okay, now you can't go back. It's not guaranteed that it will ever become a member state like Turkey. It's up to the country itself. In the end, they have to follow the rules. That's it. And if they don't, well, they cannot become a member. But the principle stands, if they follow the rules, they prepare, they can become a member. You cannot come back from that. And like I said, with Armenia, Azerbaijan, who knows? I see it happening that they apply for membership, actually, politically, absolutely. But in the end, the borders are really given geographically. It's black and white in that sense, but it's completely gray where those borders exactly are. Russia, by the way, in the 90s, after Gorbachev had gone and Yeltsin was president of Russia, he seriously considered applying for membership. That sounds weird now, but if Russia would ever apply for membership, you cannot refuse it on the grounds that it is not European. It has always been considered a part of Europe. Of course, Siberia is not Europe, but then you cannot say, well, this part of your country gets in and the other part stays out. It doesn't work like that. And like I said, it sounds completely weird now with Putin and everything and whoever follows him, but theoretically it's possible. Like Belarus as well, Ukraine obviously. So it's a beautiful thought, but don't hold your breath.
Thank you.
Okay.
Can you pass the microphone over here?
I have a question that I've been looking for an answer for a while, and I would like to know your perspective on this. How is it that the Vatican, being a state in the EU, does not meet one of the most foremost criteria of the Copenhagen criteria that it should be democratic, while at the same time it can be part of the EU?
Well, you have to be a democracy or have a democracy before you can enter, when you apply for membership. This has been always a rule, except it was made explicit for the first time in 1993. But it was clearly always a rule. I explained that Spain, Portugal and Greece, they were thinking seriously about applying, but they were told, no, you cannot apply because you're not a democracy. And as soon as they turned themselves into democracy, one of the first things they did was to apply for membership in order to protect their fledgling democracy. Because it's a bit also like smoking, by the way. That's another nice comparison for you. So becoming a member is maybe becoming the club of non-smokers. Because you don't need anybody to tell you how to not smoke. You know how to do that, right? You just stop smoking. But you also know it's pretty difficult. If you stop smoking, I'm not going to bet on you that you actually will continue to stop smoking. Now, if you become a member of a club that controls that you not smoke, you might still smoke, because all the members know how difficult it is. You might still smoke, but now I can bet on you, because the chances that you will actually continue that, because now you're a part of a club and you hold each other to those rules, your chances have increased dramatically. So this is a bit like with the democracy as well. Your democracy might still be under threat as part of the club, but there's more countervailing forces now, both from the other member states and the European Commission, that you will hold the course. And if not, there's going to be a lot more consequences that you're out if you would have been outside and lost your democracy, because who is going to oppose you? Certainly nobody in your own country, because you control your own country. That's the kind of, so the non-smokers club, so to speak. You have a stronger chance to hold through. But the thinking of democracy was foundational to the EU. This is to protect democracies, because you know what happens when you lose it. Look at Germany after in the Second World War.
But at the same time, Vatican, it's a monarchy, right? Under the Pope.
Well, a monarchy, well, many of the countries are constitutional monarchies, including the Netherlands, but that doesn't prevent the democracy from happening.
While at the same time, the members of the state have special privileged rights where only a few of the...
Well, listen, I mean, these are political decisions indeed. I completely disagree, for instance, with the monarchy in the Netherlands. I think they have way too much political power and they don't pay taxes. And it's not like the monarchies in Denmark and Sweden and Norway, because they pay taxes and they have no not really special privileges. Well, that's a internal political decision that, again, does not undermine the democracy, because they can be democratically chosen that, okay, their monarchy has some special privileges. And that can be, like I said, democratically be decided by the parliament and the voters. Because they think, well, this is such a special thing that we have, we want to give it some privileges. Again, it doesn't, as long as the decisions that are being made on that are democratically done. You can still choose about a very unfair economic development, although, or economic division of wealth and income. But that's usually not a very good idea in a democracy to vote for that, or as a political party to propose that. I know. Okay, listen. I think.
So
yeah,
on that note, let's thank a second time Willem Noë for excellent presentation.